So I would now like to invite Tobias Tröger from Goethe University of Frankfurt that will present the venture capital contracting and its work of Luca, Enriques, Casimiro, Nigro and Tobias Tröger. You have the floor.
Thanks, Christoph. So one thing you can be sure about, if a German lawyer presents a paper, the word to jokes ratio goes down. So joint work with Luca and Casimiro. Luca is here. He can correct all my errors. What we want to do here in this paper is essentially ask the question more specifically, how does corporate law prevent efficient VC contracting in non-US jurisdictions? So basically the idea is that you see this relatively vibrant venture capital market in the US and you see significantly less vibrant markets elsewhere. And what role does corporate law play in that picture, in explaining that picture? So we want to look at the interrelation of venture capital market development, evolution of venture capital markets, and the institutions of corporate law and governance, and then more specifically come up with a hypothesis that it's basically rigid corporate law in action, so not so much what you see on the books, that prevents private ordering in the venture capital space and therefore has an impact on the value of those financing contracts that you can write in these jurisdictions, and therefore the law prevents the efficient contract from being written in these jurisdictions, and therefore there is a negative cost of capital effect on that. And then we talk about Germany and Italy. One, because these are the jurisdictions that we're reasonably comfortable that we can say something meaningful about, but also because we think they are somewhat an example of other jurisdictions in continental Europe, and therefore they can tell something with some external validity. And if I have time, I also want to talk a little bit about the policy implications of our findings. So just to motivate a little bit, so probably all of you have seen some of these graphs. So the lines that are interesting here are the blue and the red one, which indicate the size of the VC markets in total investments for the observation period. The left-hand side is just the total numbers. The other one is scale to GDP. And there you can see that Europe is trailing the US quite significantly. Germany as well. Italy is just seems like flat. Because there's not much happening. And this similar picture you get if you look at the individual investment, so the individual deals. You also see the US is much larger. The Italian outliers in the green line are there because essentially the median is driven by one observation. So there's only one observation that year. It's frequent data, so it's self-reported, and therefore that is just one deal, which is super large, and then this is the median all of a sudden. But in general, the picture remains, so these markets seem to be smaller in total size, but also in individual deals. And one of the reasons that we could come up with, of course, as lawyers is, yeah, what about the law? How does the law influence that? And there's a vast literature already which looks into the institutional determinants of venture capital markets, and also including the influence of corporate law. I just put a couple papers, Franklin Allen, Josh Lerner, Antoinette Chouard, who have looked at the interrelation and come up with some determinants in the legal system. But then there's also a paper by Steve Kaplan and Per Strömberg that looks a little bit deeper, not so much into the characteristics of special legal orders, but says, okay, what venture capital is about is essentially a private ordering exercise, and therefore the question really is, how hospitable are these jurisdictions towards this private ordering exercise? And what they find is that, 2007, so everybody's still obsessed with this idea that common law is different from civil law in this respect. And they're saying, yeah, well, there seem to be few institutional impediments to implement US-style contractual provisions in non-US jurisdictions. And that is sort of essentially the theory of a Cozy bargaining coming up. So wherever you start in the allocation of cash flow and control rights, governance rights, you can, through private ordering, alter this default corporate contract and get your corporate contract that you need for your venture capital financing. And here we say, well, maybe not, because the quality of corporate law as such may not matter that much. It's really the rigidity or the flexibility of corporate law that drives this, because that is the background against which you can exercise your private ordering or you can't. And therefore, the relative flexibility of corporate law may affect the contract design and therefore also have efficiency implications. So basically, what private ordering does, as I have said, is redesigning the standard corporate contract that comes out of the statutes and does a shapeshift. So the firm, its allocation of control rights, its allocation of cash flow rights looks entirely different than it is in the statutory default rules. And therefore, if your corporate law prevents exactly that, your transaction costs increase, you reduce the value of the contract that you can write because it's not efficient for the kind of venture that you want to finance, and that should translate into a higher cost of capital. And now you get it, because if that's the case, then at the margin, fewer deals might go through. So therefore, what we have as a conceptual framework for our analysis is essentially we're saying corporate law, if it's rigid, can prevent efficient contracting altogether by simply saying we have an absolute prohibition for certain provisions in the venture capital contract that have proven efficient in the context of US venture capital contracting, and you just can't do that. And the other alternative is, well, you can do something similar, but it's not as effective as the US example is, simply because there are some relative prohibitions which make it harder for you to replicate the US model. And this, at the margin, rigid corporate law can prevent VC deals, simply because if your contract is less valuable, people are not willing to finance at the same conditions, and therefore projects that might have a positive net present value in the US might not in the other jurisdictions, simply because you don't get the same efficient contracting. So that's the basic framework, and it relates to this Kaplan-Sternberg article, and just digs a little bit deeper by saying, even if the provision in the contract, that's what they do, looks like a US provision, you have to look at the contract law and corporate law background, and whether that actually works in practice is an issue. Now, in a 15-minute presentation, just very, very rough. So what's the difference between the European jurisdictions that we look at and the US corporate law system? In general, US corporate law is flexible, and it allows exactly that kind of state contingent allocation of cash flow and governance rights that you want to have in your venture capital contract. It also allows for a standardized contracting that yields contracts that are presumably enforceable in court. There's a National Venture Capital Association that has basically more or less the same the sole purpose of enabling that. And quite revealing anecdote, so we talked, of course, when we started this project, we talked to the German and the Italian venture capital associations, and we learned that they perceive themselves not as in the business of creating standardized contracts. So that's not their purpose. I don't know what their purpose is, but anyway, so the thing is, that's not their purpose. And then, quite importantly, what you also see in the US is generally a deferential judiciary, so they accept the outcomes of private ordering and only see themselves as policing opportunism. And that's different from what you see in continental Europe, because their courts, and particularly also legal scholarship, which is practitioner-oriented, is focused more on having ex-post fair outcomes. So it's not so much what people have been contracting for, it's more you're looking at what is the outcome, and then you come up with all sorts of non-VC specific legal doctrines to intervene in the contractual agreement and have meddle with the allocation of cash flow and governance rights that you see in the contract. So one thing that allows you really, if you have sleeping problems, I recommend this paper which has come out just this week actually, which gives you the full picture. So we go through all the clauses in the VC contract and try to make the point why they don't work as nicely as they do in the US in other jurisdictions. It's a very boring read. So when I went into academia, I never wanted to do doctrinal work. I never wanted to do anything that has to do with how the law is applied in practice. that's what we did. And therefore, this is sort of, consider that as an appendix to our conceptual work, but it's somewhat the proof that we're not entirely after something that's not relevant. Okay, so just one example. US contracts typically include a provision on cumulative and automatic dividends, where essentially these are payable on a liquidity event, so be that an IPO or a trade sale, and they are maturing regardless of whether the firm has become profitable, and they are also independent of any board deliberations or any other competent body within the venture capital-backed firm. So therefore, they are somewhat self-enforcing. And what that gives you is an interest like time value of money adjustment of the venture capitalist liquidation preferences, so they sort of receive a downside protection in that scenario. And that is simply off limits in both Germany and Italy. And the reason simply why both jurisdictions are prohibiting is the very, very blurry doctrine that the shares that you have to grant are essentially residual claims, and therefore they can only receive payouts from profits that are realized, and always you need ad hoc shareholder involvement. So automatic is off, and basically cumulative is also off if you don't have a profitable venture. So this downside protection doesn't work. And a similar story you can make for liquidation preferences. What they give you essentially is a preference for the venture capital fund to essentially tap into firm value prior to the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur gets nothing despite the fact that the venture capital fund may take out a lot of the firm value. And this is something that can be seen as a signaling device. So from efficiency perspective, you could say it's a signaling device because the entrepreneur who knows that they will receive only at a very late stage, if the venture is really successful, they can show we're willing to accept this, and therefore we determine and put a lot of trust in our venture. That allows, on the other hand, the venture capitalist to screen out the non-viable enterprises, and also, of course, the entrepreneur gets incentivized to provide optimal effort. So you can make an efficiency rationale for that. And once again, both German and Italian law, and I'm only going to tell you the German story here, do not accept this kind of provision. They say, no, you can't do that simply because we control ex post whether the outcomes are okay, and if they are not fair, we think a disproportionate fraction of firm value has been allocated to one of the to the venture capital fund, and therefore this is a non-viable clause. And the funny thing is, just to give you an idea, that this is nothing VC specific. The legal doctrine that this is based on is immorality. So it's quite strong. And of course you can think about many things that come out of the Silicon Valley as immoral, but probably not liquidation preferences. So therefore, what this does is it only looks at this ex post outcome and neglects entirely the ex ante bargain that has come up with it, and that is, can at least be justified as mutually beneficial. Now, I could go on, but as I said, more for your night's sleep, not so much for today. Therefore, let me just briefly touch upon the policy implications. So what our work shows is that, yes, it's not really possible to replicate the US model. The contracts, and that's quite interesting, the contracts look very similar, and the clauses also are named the same, but they don't perform the same. And I think that is the point that we want to make. And when we first presented that, when we got massive pushbacks from particularly the bar, because they said, yeah, you're trashing our product. You're just, we're offering these wonderful drafted contracts, and now we have a spin how we can sell it, and tell them, no. You're despite all these restrictions, you're coming up with an okay product. But the thing is, from the policy perspective, it's suboptimal, right? So as I said, it's at the margin. And of course, the question is, how thick is this margin, or how thin is the margin? And when I originally signed up to the project, I thought, this is great. Maybe we can somehow quantify that. We haven't gone there. Just took us many, many years to just write that up, what we have. But we have an intuition. So if your venture is successful, the contracts don't matter. But when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. So it's more about negative scenarios where you can really get a little bit of a feeling how these protections and how these precautions that you take in the contract do actually matter. But one important policy implication that I want to highlight here is it's not so easy to address the problem because it really comes from a deeply ingrained anti-private ordering stance that instrumentalizes legal doctrine to get away from that. And therefore, you know, if you just promulgate laxer rules or tell certain courts, yeah, you can't do that, that's probably not going to do for that. What you probably need is an autonomous regime that limits court interventions altogether. And we propose in another paper that it could be an insulated standard VC charter that only applies to venture capital backed firms and is largely insulated and then can be at the European level to get away from these national courts. I leave it here and I'm looking forward to Geneviève's discussion. Thank you.
So Ludo told us, or Ludovic, told us, you know, it's only good if there is blood, right? So I recognize a French passion. But I want to say that because it's a comparative paper, we can only, you know, be in the French mood, right? It's actually about Germany, Italy, and the Anglo-American sort of culture. So I feel allowed, or I feel, you know, feel allowed to tell you, to share with you the following remark that was made to me by an opera singer. So someone who's very much into poetry because they sing poetry. So Anglo-American poetry is all about the landscape. You know, it's quite boring actually. Works well, but you know. German poetry, it's all about how life is full of gloom and it's terrible because anyway we're going to die. And actually, if you look at the paper, page 32, this table with, you know, what is viable, nothing, what is unviable, everything, it's full of gloom, and exactly, you know, this is what it is. And Italian poetry is all about the true love, you know, true love. And so perhaps, you know, sort of this genuineness and this honesty also shows up in page 32. And I must say, the whole paper is very much written like poetry. You know, it's very, very, very precisely crafted. But there's no French sort of law in this paper, but I share with you anyway what French poetry is all about. It's all about lust. It's about desire. So, so this comparison, so we are here, you know, with the tension between emotions, and actually we are in a trilogy, you know, as was mentioned. This is one paper out of three, and perhaps there is a fourth paper that I'm going to call for. You'll see in my comments. So the contribution, as you understood, you know, relates to, you know, various things, including the formal and informal institutional determinants of VC investments and the role of corporate law. And in particular, role of corporate law understood as, you know, not what is usually looked at in law and finance, which is very much, you know, what is very obvious to find, which is, you know, mostly securities law and in any case law in the book. It's also about corporate law rigid structure versus a more flexible structure. So it's about this, you know, it's commonly referred to as the common law civil law position. The importance of corporate law's flexibility to support not only entrepreneurship, but also more generally financial innovation. And the difference in corporate law matter for the allocation of cash flow and control rights in VC-backed firms and startups, and how, you know, sort of corporate law might make a difference in what is really at the core of this sort of commitment of VCs towards entrepreneur and their willingness to go ahead. And finally, it's also about contractual transplant, and the authors say, you know, we use transplant, we know transplant is more for law, so perhaps actually you could use another term. What about using import, which is a suggestion. So the perspective in the paper, as you heard, is law in action, and we're reminded that, you know, corporate law rules, they exist. In theory, we believe that they are quite narrow, you know, minimum capital, limitation of fiduciary waiver, etc., and that they are mostly default. This is what we learn at university. You know, they can be altered. Well, there might be some transaction costs, but you can get out of the default. And then there is another layer which is the sort of the contractual layer, whether it's corporate contract or contract, corporate chapters, bylaws, but also shareholders' agreement, and all these elements. So in action, what we understand reading the paper is that it's quite muddy, the interplay between the two. I think corporate law is, provides default, and then you come up with your contractual layer, and you can displace the default and put in place the bargain that one would expect and one would prefer for efficiency purposes. But it's not that simple. And this Law and Finance 2.0 inquiry make it clear by showing that the rules themselves, what the Doing Business report was using, don't tell us much. The economic rationality purely doesn't tell us much either about what really happens. But we need to look at a thicker sort of perspective of what's going on. And Elizabeth is, and I think Dorothy should be here as well. So this machine word that they coined for us that we can use here again. This is a corporate governance machine, or the venture capital corporate governance machine. So the motivation for the paper is the idea that you look at the curves. It's too flat. We want more venture capital investments. There should be more venture capital investments in Europe. The European Silicon Valley, or the Berlin Silicon Valley, the Turin Silicon Valley, with the assumption that in startups, governance quality is a function of bargaining. Right? And if corporate law channels more rigidity, it's less efficient. So this is a very sort of very clear, simple but very very strong idea, which is at the core of the paper. And there is a presumption, it's defined as a presumption, that US contractual framework is efficient. And I suppose you don't demonstrate it, but I suppose you just have to look at the figures and look at the form of the graph. So I have a few questions. So the first question is, which contract? Because actually it would be interesting perhaps to make a difference and to try and disentangle various levels of contractual sort of entries. Yeah, of course, the bylaws can include contractual sort of provisions and bargaining. So this is a dual class, but it also the preferred stock. There can be also shareholders agreement, and I think this is more what you focus on. But what about a mix between the two? This incorporated shareholders agreement. So we have been, some of us have been together for the past few days, and we have talked about the French SAS. I can't resist talking about French law. So this corporation, which actually is like a blank sheet, right, and offers a possibility for the shareholders agreement to be part of the bylaws, which of course has enforcement consequences, because it has the force of the corporate contract and not only the contractual contract. Second question, which rigidity? So the paper makes a nice distinction, and I think it's even the companion paper which makes it, between absolute rigidity and relative rigidity. Absolute, no, you can't do it. You can't do what the American clause offers, and there is no functional equivalent. There is no way around. You can't bypass it. Versus relative, where you can do it differently, and perhaps it's not as efficient, more costly, etc., but it's still possible. My understanding is that actually the strict prohibitions remain quite limited. Sort of Kaplan is not completely wrong. So I think you point out interesting sort of elements of comparison, and you make it clear that there's a lot of relative prohibition, but I'm under the impression that absolute prohibition is not the majority. What I also understand that interpretation is key in those in this rigidity, and one could think that interpretation can go both ways. You are unsure, and therefore, we open the door, or you are unsure, and it's more restrictive, and investors are less likely to invest. And what seems to be the case is that there's an uncertainty culture. So anytime the interpretation is present, and in those sort of because it's non-part of the code itself. So there's a lot of interpretation going on. And uncertainty is always pushed towards the direction of, it's not going to be enforced. Right? Two more questions. So what channels of, three perhaps, what channels of rigidity? First, I observed that there's a stickiness of the governing law. I even wonder how come there are any investment governed by German law or Italian law. One could think, they could, this could be taken into Delaware law, or we could do a top corporation, and actually Dutch law perhaps is quite successful for that reason. There seems to be also, I believe, even if it's not something you mentioned, a stickiness of the market templates, the market practices, things that have been copied over from things that have been done, have ever been done. Perhaps an influences of the regulatory technology as well, council saying, if you want to go further, if you want to be listed, you should already do that because this is what the regulator will prefer in the future. And the point you make very clearly is that all of this, right, is leveraged by the venture capital corporate machine. And you explained to us there are two channels, practitioners and courts, and I will finish on that. Practitioners, you say it's a second sort of, it's perhaps not so important at the court, the way court enforce the agreements, or actually don't enforce the agreements. I would have liked to know more about it. I want to hear more about those German lawyers or those Italian notaries that what happens, what makes them reason the way they are. At Oxford, the best students are German students, I find. So they are great lawyers. They understand, they know they have these depths of legal culture, etc. How come suddenly they go back home and they got so stuck? I don't get it. Second, and you also mentioned the court intensity of scrutiny, but Christopher is looking at me with mad eyes, so I'll stop here.
Before giving the floor to the audience, maybe a short reply.
Very quick. So first of all, I can assure you we have quibbled around about these words quite a lot, and therefore I'm reluctant to change from transplant to imports. I see the point in that, but more substantively, if you really wade through all this stuff in the analysis, you will realize that we're carefully distinguishing between charter provisions, shareholder agreements, etc., simply because there are differences in functionality, as you rightly said. And just to highlight the main point, this is about self-enforcement versus you have to really push through an obligation in court if someone reneges against the obligations that you have in a shareholder agreement. And therefore, we're aware of the differences, and we see frequently that the workaround that you get in these jurisdictions is you relegate certain provisions that you see in US charters to shareholder provisions. But that has exactly that effect on, this negative effect on enforceability. With regard to the distribution of absolute and relative prohibitions, you're entirely right. That's an outlier. We should, so absolute prohibitions are really an outlier, so we should highlight that maybe. And with regard to the interpretation issue, yes, you're totally right. Much of what we present is speculation in a sense because there are no precedents. So we cannot really rely on any court decisions that tell us this is how we interpret the law. But what we do is we think a best effort attempt to predict how courts, if they were presented with the issues, would decide. And there, the scholarship plays a role because in these jurisdictions, scholars carry some weight in the deliberations of courts. So they cite scholarship, they really go into that, into the doctrinal work, and therefore you have something that you can build on, and therefore we think, yes, the speculation is right. Last point, choice of law. Yeah, that's right. We, of course, discussed that as well. And the general take that we have is for very early stage venture capital-backed firms, This is simply not an option because of the cost that this entails, because you have to answer to many jurisdictions. By then you get the corporate law, which might be more hospitable towards your, but you also have to somewhat see the interfaces. You have still to present your accounting, for example, under German accounting rules, which makes it very difficult. So the compliance costs go up, and therefore what we see, and Casimiro has an empirical study which looks at where early stage firms actually incorporate, and you see that if it's a German venture, it incorporates in Germany, despite the fact that legally it's possible. You could go somewhere else. You could go to Delaware, indeed, and you see that at later stages happening. That's right. And we talked offline about German lawyers. So this is...
Okay. I have Bobby, Roy, Jeff, Holger, and Umakant. Maybe Roy, you were first, and also...
So, everything you're saying sounds super plausible, but I was wondering whether you also consider the reverse causality story, which is not mutually exclusive. So meaning your argument is that bad corporate law hinders the development of private ordering, but it could also be that bad private ordering hinders the development of good law. So if you're living in one ecosystem and you have a lot of risk-taking and a lot of VCs competing over shooting the moon investments, you have tolerance for failures, and VCs don't want to take entrepreneurs to court because it will hurt their reputation. They want to keep being able to purchase these lottery tickets. And so the selection of cases to trial, by the time the few cases get to trials, the courts can afford to stick to the contract. And if you have another system where you don't have as much risk-taking and as much VC competition, then the system doesn't deter as well VC opportunism. And so by the time you get to court, the court may say, you know, I want to intervene here.
Maybe an account. We'll stay there.
Thanks. Tobias, just a quick comment and a question. The comment is that, you were talking about Germany and Italy. It seems to me that it could be quite a universal issue. So in that sense, US is the outlier, and a lot of other countries around the world will face the same issues as Germany and Italy have been. So maybe the implications of your project may be much larger than you have portrayed. And the question that I had was, the solution that you've come up with is possible changes to charter and bylaws and so on. But in many jurisdictions around the world, there's also a hierarchy of norms. So from a pure doctrinal perspective, if the obstacle is in the corporate law, can you unblock the obstacle by just changing the charter documents? I think that might be a bit challenging from a pure legal perspective. So that'll be interesting to see how that pans out.
Okay. We will group then, and Bobby, you also. Okay, June. Okay, that's fine.
Thanks. So I guess I would just encourage you to think about whether all of these provisions should get equal weight in the sense of importance. And so the reason I say that is in the US, for instance, the model that Kaplan sort of outlined in 2007 is not the model that you typically see today for sort of the modal startup. And so you think about in 2007 things like redemption, cumulative dividends, all that stuff may have been part of the menu, but today it's really not. There's really been a convergence towards a really stripped down form of financing in the US, and that's in part, I think, an awareness that the returns come entirely from your successes, and basically sort of being able to sort of, salvage some of your liquidation preferences in some sense just a waste of time. And so the US, I think there's increasing, that there's really an importance in terms of basically having equity compensation, which is something that Europe has not typically been sort of accustomed to. And so maybe you might want to rank order about like what are the terms that really matter and one of the ones that don't, and then that might give you some purchase in terms of the extent to which there's really differences between the two contracting environments.
Shall we take Jeff's, and then you first reply, and then we go for the second round?
In a sense, what I was going to say is better put by the last discussant, which is, the canonical story, the VC story, is 90% fail and 10% succeed, and the gains are all in the 10%, and is, So you've focused, in effect, on how hard it is to squeeze the last juice out of the 90% that fails. And the question, the Bobby point in mind too, is how hard is it to get the gains from the 10% that succeed? And so it does seem to me that, the doom and gloom here is you've looked at how hard it is to collect from the downside, the 90% that fail, but maybe the real problem is how hard it is to gain from the 10% that succeed. And is that a law issue or a markets issue or whatever? You know, and it seems to me that in trying, I mean, if the goal really is to give an account of the comparison between, you know, the two curves of the VC and the US, at least part of what you do ought to be to look at whether it's easy to gain from how the comparisons of extracting VC gains on the 10% or whatever percent that succeed, as well as minimizing the downside in the ones that fail.
Okay, thanks a lot. Very, very helpful comments. So Roy's point on the reverse causality, yeah, it's a somewhat plausible story, but I'm not 100% sure why people are then so vigilant about their contracting, because they try hard, right? So they try to write these contracts, and they try to write good contracts, but then they fail. And what we keep hearing, because I mean we don't have systematic evidence because we don't have the VC contracts, but what we have is, of course, not interviews, but talks with practitioners, and they tell us, no, this is important for us. So we want to have these contracts. It's not that we just have given up, and therefore, you know, whatever, it's the Wild West. Umakant, yes, of course, we hope that it's relevant beyond Germany and Italy, and I think I share your intuition that the US is the outlier here. With regard to your question, so Europe has tinkered a little bit with these standardized charters, and they are provided by legislation. So the legislation essentially provides the charter and then says, look, this is something that is for courts off limits. So if you subscribe to that standardized charter, courts don't interfere. That, I agree, creates all sorts of other problems, because by definition, these charters will be incomplete at some point, and then, of course, you need some decisions by someone who will fill the gaps. And then, of course, you're back in the old system probably to a certain degree. But we think incrementally that helps. Bobby, yes, we've discussed that. And the unfortunate thing, a little bit, if you really want to rank the provisions, then there's no agreement on which ones matter, because then people keep telling you, but this is also relevant, this is also relevant. So therefore, so far, I think I totally agree with your assessment, but the reason why we presented is because we wanted to sort of insulate our analysis from this critique. You're missing the relevant parts. So therefore, we just show that more or less everywhere it's the same, it doesn't work. Jeff's point, very well, we have to look into that. We haven't done that. So we just, there's anecdotal evidence. So Mark Andreessen, he said that, you know what, the downside protection matters, because that's actually where we make a difference between the funds. Everybody can, if they have a unicorn, they can take out whatever they have. But it's really the marginal difference between the funds, that's what he said, I don't know, is really in those that not really fail, but that are somewhat not performing too well, and how much can we take out of that? I don't, but we have to look into that. My intuition is that maybe there is also a difference in how much you can take out in relative terms, because many of these, ex post fair outcome reviews would probably also apply in these scenarios. So maybe there's also a cap on what you can take out in the succeeding ventures.
Okay, second round, we still have 5 minutes. We started 5 minutes late. I know Holger.
Yeah, so Tobias, you were a little bit poo-pooing the legal analysis and how it's boring, but I really think that this is what matters, because in the abstract, some of the things you've said, they would also apply to US law. Delaware has the fiduciary duty of loyalty that you cannot contract out of. It requires entire fairness for all conflicted transactions. Many VC fund transactions are conflicted. The entire fairness is notionally an exposed concept. Just like you said for the European law, if you are based in California, then you are subject to Section 2115 of the California Corporation Code, which applies California law to you, whether you want it or not. So, like, in the abstract, if you just say it abstractly, you might think the US law is just as bad as the European law is. And perhaps the contracts that we see are just the ones that over time have sort of evolved under these constraints, and they work there, but others might also work. And I'm not saying this to argue this position. I actually don't think that's true, but to differentiate from your European picture, I think you really need to show us the law, and I know you've done it, and I would encourage you to show it to us. The last point about the judges, I think my theory of the European judges is that they are very good, as Geneviève said, maybe, but they are recruited into being judges at age 28. So their entire life, they will have been employees, tenants, and consumers. And that shapes their worldview. So when they see some big financial fund and some poor entrepreneur, it's clear which side they're on. And that's how they will rule.
I think Jill is first.
So 2 quick points. First, I want to double down on Roy's observation about reverse causality, because I think if you look at the legislative history to Delaware 122.18, it's a great example of, the law wasn't working, and so industry stepped in and said, look, we need a different law, we need more flexibility, and got it. So I think that you do have to take that seriously. And that leads to the second point, which is I think the idea of courts weighing in, and that is a threat, has traditionally in US venture capital practice been largely absent for some of the market reasons, right? So if there's never going to be a challenge to a contract provision, the theoretical analysis that there's some sort of binding constraint on what we can do, right, doesn't really matter. And Moelis is this weird exception, except that it's not an exception. It's a public company. It's shareholder litigation in the public company space is just so different from litigation in private venture capital backed firms. So I think what you are talking about in the European context is a judicial constraint that has traditionally been absent. And if you look at things like the Model Venture Capital Association documents, there are provisions that people have said for years, is this really legal? Can they do that? And this is in the model. This isn't a sort of one-off. Right, but it's just a different universe, and so I think at least that has to be at least part of the story.
Thank you. Still Yisha, I have Eric, and then Jerry, and the rest I apologize. You can approach the authors during the break.
Okay, I'm not sure how relevant this is, but like 25 years ago, there was this notion that what's preventing the VC industry from developing in Germany, Italy, and so on, was the absence of markets for exits, right? So then there was this Nuovo Mercato and Neue Markt and so on. But it didn't change the picture. So maybe, and logically, this is a little bit like this, right? So maybe what's preventing VCs from appearing in Italy or Germany is the legal framework, but maybe the issue is not there, but in the supply of entrepreneurial projects or labor laws or stuff like this?
Hey, Tobias, I've got a couple of legal observations that I will not bore the audience with because we're pressed on time. But I want to ping you on a particular sort of relationship between this project and kind of the finance angle of it. So a lot of what you were talking about in the presentation of the paper, I think, has to do with valuation discounts on the ability of a firm to realize its full valuation. But it doesn't have obvious implications on expected returns on cost of capital, return on equity, return on debt, right? That if you could have a valuation discount of 20%, right? This thing's worth 80% of what it should otherwise be, but that amount grows at market rates, right? So I want to understand which of these points should be visited in terms of returns versus what should be visited in terms of like the denominator effect, right? Just the total value of the company.
Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Thanks. It's a very interesting paper. Actually, how the thinking about the VC contracting is efficient given that you have this law regime right there. So, which meaning that even if you lose it, you may not jump to another kind of optimal point because, you know, there are also other factors affecting the VC contracting, for example, labor law, right, which is shown in Silicon Valley is very important when, you know, VC try to invest and contracting with the startups firms. I think that would be the first one. Second one is that when we look at the shareholder, you know, kind of these what are law constraints, right? Because German has many kind of firms with many generations. You know, they have. I think this could sort of relate to their management style. You know, the kind of like cultural side where the VC contracting might need to reflect in those as well, not just law. I think law is just one perspective. Thanks.
Okay, just quickly. So how much time do I have? Because then I can defer the difficult ones to the break.
A couple of minutes. But then
Okay, that's too much. Okay, anyway, so Holger, yeah, great. I'm happy to. I mean, we shared the legal analysis on Monday, so we've been going back and forth about this, and we will integrate it into that paper even more upon suggestions. That's for sure. The judiciary, as you mentioned, I think that's an important aspect. You have a different, so it's a career path that you take at a very early stage. That's one thing, and then also I think the cases that you're typically trained on in practice are not VC or anything like that. So the way that you work up your ranks in the German judiciary is you're at the trial court level, you get, you know, the garden variety of cases, so there's no specialization. So that's also something, of course, that's setting all these jurisdictions apart from Delaware, where you have a specialized judiciary. So that certainly all plays into that, and therefore it may not be entirely unexpected that these brilliant students who go to Harvard, Oxford, wherever, and then just end up in the judiciary still don't get it. Anyway, Jill, sure. I think this is something that we need to consider more in the sense that I think in all these jurisdictions, one of the common features is that you don't see a lot of litigation. So the question is, how much does the law and the prospect or the threat of judicial intervention serve as a background against which contracting happens? And I think we're perfectly aware of that. And you know, we make the point that we think that as a bargaining tool, and you know, it's interesting also, whoever you ask in the US, they will tell you different stories. So now you're telling me, yeah, this is important. Others have told us, no, this is just not important. It's not going to happen. So you know, Trados is an outlier, Most is an outlier. So I don't know what to believe, but I think we at least account for that because we go to great lengths to make our point that at least as a background for the negotiations, this judicial intervention prospect really matters. Jerry's and Yishai's comments totally sold on that. So we, you know, it's a déformation professionnelle, to use the French term, that of course we think corporate law matters. Maybe it doesn't. So, but I think we show at least a plausible story why at the margin it could matter. There might be other factors that are driving it, be that the exit opportunity, be that rigid labor laws, et cetera, et cetera. So these might be even more powerful drivers, and you know, taxes maybe, but you know, you can only do so much. Eric, well, I think that why it matters for expected returns is if you look at the downward scenario where the firm is not performing well, then of course the question, how much can you take out by through your precautions that you take in the contract, matters. So this is exactly that story. So we can talk about that, but I think that it does matter. It's not only about firm value, it's really about expected value. But anyway. Okay, thank you so much for these super helpful comments. Thank you.
I think dinner is outside. Lunch is outside.